Man.
Yeah.
Yesterday.
Huh?
Technique. Yeah, yeah, that was, she was really.
That's in my.
Somehow he knew. I wonder if she'll try again. So he was. Really?
I don't know how much control she actually has.
To look at the comments, he has a leading partner. But her male is his family. Child, they're not sure. Everybody's asking.
Yeah, yeah.
Series coming out.
Oh, she's so just. Meet new people.
Just amazed they.
Those destroyers. But
Oh, yeah.
FaceTime
Help
with her. He went up and
They're almost like.
Wow.
closed up.
No, I mean, she very in the right situation.
The best they're about 7. Just a Cajun captain down on the way and stand by and by 6 to 8 forward. Large clearance.
Yeah. Back on the kayaking and going over stone stuff. Because of her long back. That sounds like an elk. They couldn't scope with her. Yeah, I don't know what that means. There must be one story that we'll find out one day. Maybe she under one.
Somewhere in the far east.
So much energy.
So this is the house rescues. I said Marley.
Fire going. They're almost out. Really. Tracy. You guys have no
Be at the house instead of family.
Yeah.
My name's Laurel Stumpton. I've been in touch with Malcolm. At the Smith. I met you at the Open Lighthouse Day.
You know, I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You must know this.
So, Jared, and my cousins live so far away, they're not able to be here. One of them is in Massachusetts, but. Yeah. I will tell them they'll be thrilled.
We talked to Spencer. We bought that house. And she.
That was Smith.
Sure.
To learn, yeah.
It's an obelisk.
But I was here before I left and came back.
Hi, I'm Laurel.
Joe.
Joe. Minot. Nice to meet you.
What is your position on the store? You're best out in the center.
Orange County.
Trustee Beth or. I volunteer a lot over.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us for all of our technical difficulties. But we're finally ready. Stream is going. You're all here. Thank you so much for joining us and for your patience. I'm Jack Martin. I'm the archivist and special collections librarian here at the Free Library. I'm sure most of you know me by now, but it's a formality. I do have to introduce myself just in case. It's so nice seeing so many of you turning up for the 21st Town History Series. We are so proud to keep the tradition going. And if you can believe it, this is the 21st year. It was all the way back in 2005 that Peter Goodwin first started it. And now we're still chugging along. This morning is the second in this year's series, and I'm sure you're all very excited for it, so I'm not planning to prattle on too long. I just want to quickly remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Patent Free Library YouTube channel early next week. The upside of our new setup for all of the difficulties we encounter doing this is that it does make getting that video uploaded a lot easier. So there'll be a quick turnaround. For those of you who are joining us online, there will be an email provided in the description of that video when it gets uploaded, and that's where you can send in any of your questions that you might have. Unfortunately, since we're not doing Zoom, there's no online Q&A. You know, some wins, some losses. We're still figuring out all the kinks, but you'll be able to submit your questions via email, and we'll make sure that you get them answered. All right, didn't have time to read through my notes as many times as normal. I'm very pleased to be welcoming back our presenter this morning. He made his first appearance at the Town History Series in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. I did my year right. Exploring the story and history of Arrowsic Island through the tale of his own historic home. Now, with 7 more years research to add, and just as many years clouding all of our memories, we are in for quite a treat as he revisits that history for us today. So without further ado, let me turn things over to the gentleman himself, Mr. Malcolm Persen.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for coming. I'm always gratified and amazed when I see the crowd that shows up for this. I'm not even sure I'm that interested in it, but that's okay. How many people attended? It was in February of 2018, the last presentation I did. Okay, good. There's a few of you, but for a lot of you, you didn't, so I won't feel so bad about maybe some of the things I did. Jack's right. The thing that has one of the things that has struck me in preparing for today's presentation is in 7 years how different the whole rich environment is, and of course there's much more material. The biggest part for those of you, excuse me, who care about these things is that so much more is digitized today. When I did this, well, we bought this house in 2008, and the first year we bought it, actually, I sold the business. Janet, my wife, and I were living in Phoenix, Arizona. This was going to be just a summer house, and but I took the year off, was unemployed, and did lots of research. But it meant going to the archives in Boston and spending hours sorting through things, Maritime Museum and here and everywhere else. And today, it's all online. It's wonderful. But anyway, and also some of the things that people asked about 7 years ago, I've gotten to do more research, and hopefully I've got the right answers. Maybe I'll still stumble, and you'll say, come back again another 7 years when you get it right. In the meantime, if I go back 17 years ago, which was the year that we first saw this house, Janet and I were looking at the time for a second home. We had one in Vermont, and for various reasons, we were giving that up. And so the story goes that I went online and I picked a bunch of sort of 3-season homes, mostly in the Harpswell area because our daughter was at Bowdoin, and because 3 seasons sounded like plenty. And we spent, and then I had to pick a real estate agent, and so the first name that came up was Andrea Galuza. Now, those of you who know Andrea know she lives in Arrowsic and is in, I will prove in a minute, she's quite good at what she does. So we go off and we look at all of these houses in Harpswell and Brunswick and various other places. And at the end of the day, neither Janet or I are very excited about anything. And she says, have you considered Arrowsic? To which I said, I can't spell it, I can't pronounce it. Why would I want to be there? And she said, well, I have one to show you. She was listing the house. And I walked in, and I will never forget this. The house was unoccupied. Obviously, as you know, our best guess is it's around 250 years old. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But I walked in, and there's peeling wallpaper. And as you walked across the living room, you could watch the cracks in the walls do this. So needless to say, I was even less enthusiastic. But Andrea persisted, and here we are 17 years later. It was taken just before Christmas, our last storm. So that is truly what it looks like today. When we bought the house, I'm somebody who's been coming up to the coast of Maine since I was about that big, but I'm obviously from away. When we bought the house, one of the things I was curious about, because I had not originally thought of buying an antique, was, well, how old is it? And spent inordinate amount of my life at that point trying to figure that out. To this day, we do not know. We have lots of pointers and evidence that I'm going to take you through. And the best guess is that it was built around 1776. The earliest record we have of a house being in this location was 1776. But coming from, I'm from New England originally, but having lived in Arizona and spent a lot of time before that, obviously in New England, and I'm a big hiker and get outdoors. I said, well, let me, start going to the documents that I understand. And the first document that I know about is a topo map, good old USGS topo map. And I said, well, let's see if it gives me any information. And lo and behold, there's our house on the map. So we know it was built before 2000. That's a so then I started to do research and the like, and of course I met Pete in the history room, and I, was meandering around, and he said, "Have you looked at the map of Saginaw County?" And those of you know it's over there. The county, when the county was broken away from Lincoln County, this map was done. It's on the corridor and on the other side here, and many of you've looked at it. And lo and behold, there's our house. And it even has the name of the owner at the time. So now we're back to at least 1858. So I'm feeling pretty heady about the whole thing. I do go down to the Massachusetts State Archives because even if it was even just early 19th century, it obviously was constructed when Maine was part of Massachusetts. And the map that I encountered there, maybe some of you have seen this in the books, was the Mark Langdon Hill map that was done in 1795. This was done, as many of you may know, because the Massachusetts legislature had lots of debts to pay left over from the Revolution, and was concerned that Maine, the communities of Maine, were not paying their fair share of taxes. So every town in Maine ordered to do a map of all of its major assets, and lo and behold, there's our house. So that got me to the next level. Now, an interesting thing I will say about going, if you ever do have, I don't know if some of you may, have an interest in pursuing some of these sources. If you go to the Massachusetts State Archives and you see something like this map was bound in a book actually. They will do all sorts of things for you to help you. And they actually, again, this was probably 2009 or so. So the technology is a little different 16 years later. But they scanned this map. And when they scanned it, it wasn't just running an HP copier. They scanned it was so many bits and bytes that it didn't fit on a CD. It had to be on a DVD. 750 megabytes was, and then in my career at that point, I've done a bunch of different things, but at that point, I had started a solar construction company in Phoenix, and we did commercial solar. And I had a guy there who did, our design work and whatnot. And he took that file off to a high quality printer that it printed, and it now essentially hangs over our mantelpiece in our dining room. the entire map. And it looks like the original. It's beautifully done, actually. So with that, my wife stumbles into that there's this old maps done by the British Admiralty. Perhaps some of you have seen this. And this was, the map itself was drawn in 1774, but was published in 1776. And lo and behold, there's our house again. So that gives us some understanding. As I'll suggest in a few minutes, as many of you may be thinking, old houses had a tendency to burn down and things like that. But we do believe the foundation is at least that old. Not sure if the structure is, and again, I'll talk more about it. So here I am armed with all of this exciting information, and off we go to learn about the house. As some of you probably noticed, the house is of the ubiquitous Cape design, which there are hundreds, if not thousands, in certainly in New England, if not in northern New England. And Cape houses are still being built. This is a classic Cape with 30 by 40, 30 feet on one dimension, 40 on the other, 2 stories deep. Many of you may be aware of things like a quarter cape, a half cape, 3/4 cape, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But this was the layout that probably was in place. The only oral histories we have on the house came from 2 individuals. Margaret, who some of you may have known, who built the house, and then Jim Spencer, who some of you may know, who lives in Arrowsic, who played in this house as a child. And Jenna, how old is Jim? He's 87. And so he has all sorts of stories. But in any case, it's a classic front entry with 3 fireplaces. You would come in here, you would up the stairs, and that would be totally open, a sleeping loft. They did everything from HB to store things, to sleep upstairs. Typically with the 2 parlors, one of the parlors would be a more formal room. To the extent that there wasn't any habit around that, it would have been in the west parlor. And that would be where you receive guests, where you would do official business, things like that. The other parlor, where everything else took place. You ate your dinner there, you played cards, you did your homework, you of course didn't watch TV in those days, but that was where you lived all the time. In the back half of the house, there would be a keeping room. And again, apologize to those of you who've heard me talk about this before, but the keeping room is a room where you kept food warm, because typically you did not cook in your house because of the fire danger. And in fact, directly across the street from this house is a cellar hole for another structure, which we do not know. We don't have any record of what it was. Might very well have been the kitchen at one point. The bourning room was a room where you went either to be born or to die, because it was warm, and next to the keeping room, a pregnant woman going in labor was positioned in there, or if you were advanced age, you might be in there. That when they wheeled you into the bourning room, you knew your days were numbered. And then typically there was another room, we called it a bedroom. Sometimes it was a bedroom, sometimes it was a storage room. Sometimes the east parlor was also used for some sleeping. But as I said earlier, mostly you went upstairs to the sleeping loft. And of course, the privy was often in that direction. And we have found the original privy using a metal detector. And today, this is the way it looks as of today, this portion anyway. We have a more conventional living room, dining room. The back room in one corner is a TV room, and the other a bathroom in 1971. If you ever come to visit us, we may sound a little bit pompous when you have us walking around, because we still call them often the parlor and the keeping room and whatnot. There's a reason we do that. Not because we're trying to honor some ancient history or anything like that, but because back when we first bought the house, and I don't know, it's probably about 2010, 2011, 12, somewhere in there, we installed a Google Assistant, the little bot. tell it, and ask it to tell you funny jokes and things like that. Well, one of the reasons we put it in was because it helped us, we could tell it what room we wanted to listen to the stereo in and the like. However, Google in their design can't tell where you are except by whatever room, whatever you call the room as you're setting it up. And what we quickly realized was if you had a living room, it didn't know whether you meant the living room in Arizona or the living room in Maine. And there would be times when you'd say, play the music in the living room, and you'd have no idea why it didn't come on. Some poor chipmunk or something in this house, because we were then in those days not using it very much in the wintertime. And so we still occasionally call them, and some of that has held over. We no longer have a house, and we have no residence in Arizona anymore. But the house is a post and beam construction, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. Otherwise, it's you can call it a timber built construction or whatnot. This is the now kitchen. And that is the exposed beams. One of the conversations that I often get into with people about dating the house was that we have a fair number of milled beams and joists and whatnot. Now, milled being that the lumber was created in a sawmill, as opposed to hewn, which is hand created. So a lot of our beams are hewn here, but in any case, some of them are milled as well. Those of you who are familiar with Arrowsic know that we've history of sawmills. At one point, there were 7 sawmills on the island of Arrowsic. So we never had a shortage, or maybe that's overstating it. There was certainly plenty of opportunity to get milled lumber compared to elsewhere. Cross pieces there are the beams. And if you think about how this works, there are what are called bends, which consists of 2 posts, obviously a roof member, and then some cross pieces. Those would be the cross pieces between the first floor and second floor. And they would build those on the ground and then put them up. In our case, we would have 6. And that's how, whether or not you had a quarter, a half, or a 3/4 cape, was how many bends did you have, bents rather, did you have in your house. If you had 1, you were a quarter. If you had 2, you were a half. If you had 3, you were a 3/4. And in this case, we actually have 6. And so that the reason that story is a setup for the next slide is because they were dealing particularly on stuff that was hand hewn, and this roof piece here is hand hewn. They were dealing with irregular lumber. Trees don't grow straight if you want a long piece of wood and whatnot. And so in order to make the pieces fit together, because you were always working angles and stuff, because you wanted the finished product to have a flat roof, you'd assemble them first on the ground and then you would put them up. Well, the other part of the story is that, of course, when a house like this was being built, it was built as a community event. You had all your neighbors come over and help you, and you spend the weekend. And one of the things, is one of the history books I read pointed out, was that there were ample libations available. And so what they had to do is to do this is they had to mark where pieces of the this is being up here, where pieces, and here would have been a collar tie, which is now gone. So when they were reassembling it after they had a couple of glasses of rum or whatever, they knew where the pieces went. Of course, otherwise you had lots of pieces down. The prior owner, house before us, in his renovation, left this piece out so that you could see that. And it was called marrying. The missing piece, which would have gone this way, would be married to this roof joist. So I'm going to pass around. This is, I think, unique in the history. In 21 years of the history talk, I think this is the first time this has happened. This is a piece of our house. And what this is this is I was explaining before how you had a post here, and this post is actually the northwest corner, which is if you're facing the house, would have been in the back. Almost invariably in the days when this house was constructed, houses were pretty much positioned to face due south. Later, we have done some more work to the house, but one of the things that has been constantly going on there is you're reconstructing and rebuilding. I like to say having a 250-year-old house means it's always under construction. And so we had to expose that back side, that back corner, only to find out that the sill, which is the piece of wood that is on top of the foundation, and in this case, the corner post, were pretty rotten. But what's interesting here is that we were able to save this piece. Now, originally, this piece probably was an 8x8. And you get some idea if you look at it here of how much the bugs have been eating it for the past 250 years. But it's interesting, for those of you who have obviously have been, probably all of you, to the Maritime Museum, that there were no nails used in the construction. And instead, we have the actual trunnel here to show the construction. And so that would have been this right here is what you see. Of course, the trunnel or tree nail was dried and inserted dry. And then because Maine is mid-place, or if you're on a ship, the wood would expand and it would become fast. Did I get this all right, Nathan? How am I doing? Not offering me a job, I guess not. Anyway, let me pass this around and you're welcome to take a look at it. And then
Is that just pine?
most, I don't know what kind of wood that is, to be honest with you. And most of the timber framing was done with hardwood if it was available. But they did use pine. That's what the book said. There's another story I can tell, but I only have an hour, so. But anyway, when we were doing another, sill. So one of the things that we also know about the house is this is a picture. It actually doesn't look like this anymore because where that piece came from used to be in this corner. So it's constructed now. But we have what's called a flagstone foundation, which was basically just a stone wall built in a hole in the ground. And it was porous. You certainly could get water in your basement frequently, and also the mice like to come through. In the 70s, Ted Bertacci, who owned the house, tried to coat it with concrete in an effort to seal it, and I assure you, it did not work. And the mice and the water still come in and whenever they're predisposed to do so. But the reason this is an important picture is because our flagstone foundation is uncapped. Typically, as construction techniques developed in northern New England, in older houses, the wall would be capped with granite. Granite was relatively available and being quarried in New Hampshire. And the notion was that gave you a flat surface to put your sill of your house on. If you go and look at if you are on Doubling Point and you look at the lighthouse buildings, the houses, you'll see that there they used concrete, and they also did granite blocks all the way down, which was about 100 years later. By 1800, at least according to the books, most people were capping their foundations. And so that's why I made the assertion earlier that maybe the house was rebuilt, burned down and rebuilt or whatever. We have no certainty to it, but probably this foundation was there beforehand, which would have been very typical. The other reason, which is a funny story, is that the house and the foundation don't match. The foundation is actually 4 inches on one side longer than the house. And I don't know how many of you know Ed Blakelock, but Ed Blakelock was doing a lot of work for us in those days. And he came to me and he said, aha, I have proof that the house and the foundation were different because somebody blew it and they didn't build the house to match the foundation. Well, Ed, I had to have a talk with him at that point. Janet and I had built another house, actually in Groton, Massachusetts, which we had built from scratch. And had all the, the architecture's CAD and all the sophisticated devices for measuring it properly. And guess what? The foundation was off by about 4 inches. So they didn't have CAD in these days. So I'm not sure that argument holds water. I don't know. But anyway. The last item I'm going to show you with regard to the history of the house is, as many of you know, there was a period of where Georgian architecture and art was sort of the guiding post in developing. Now, this was a sea captain's house originally. I'll talk about that in a minute. But and it had, by the way, very high ceilings for a house of its age, which was an indication it was a little bit different and probably showing off some of the wealth of the owner. But the most of the fine stuff and the moldings and whatnot, which are the key parts of this conversation to determine whether you're looking at Georgian Federalist period, is pretty simple. Nonetheless, this door, and I'll point out here, this is an H hinge, and you'll see how worn the hinge is. This door appears we have pictures going back to the 50s. Unfortunately, most of them are not in adequate quality for me to project them here. But in any case, we know that this door is fairly old and probably original, because inside there is actually original plaster as well, which is another aspect that is another conversation. But it is a 6-panel door, and a 6-panel door is typically more of the Federalist period, which started about 1825. Now, my contention here is that, as I will show you in a few minutes, the house has not been owned by a lot of families, but it has gone through a couple of changes. I know what we did when we bought it. I know what the people we bought it from did when they bought it in 1971. The first thing you do, you walk into this and you say, my God, I can see the cracks in the wall. We need to fix this place. And not only that, of course, we put in a dishwasher and we put in a modern stove and all of that. So if you walked in and looked at our kitchen today, you'd say, well, this is obviously built in about 10 years ago. And I'm guessing that some of the reason why you see the various aspects of different types of architecture is because as people turned it over, probably the first thing they did, and I'll show you some other evidence of that, is to renovate it to their style when they did that. I'm going to take you through the owner's record, and each has a little story. James Drummond and his brother Patrick Drummond, by the way, is probably better known. There's a fair amount of documentation on Patrick Drummond, were the sons of Alexander Drummond Sr., who came over from Ireland, but was Scottish, and settled up on Merrymeeting Bay. And as we'll talk about in the next slide, I'll talk a little about the development history of Arrowsic. But he actually, Alexander Drummond, died about 4 years after he got here. He got hit by a tree falling on him. His sons took over, and James had 2 sons in turn, James Jr. and Alexander. And if you do look at the Drummond history in the history room or online and all the digitized history, you'll see there are lots of Alexander Drummonds, but typically there's only one captain, and that would have been the guy. And so James Drummond bought a strip of land. Now, this is a little hard to visualize, but if you, this is Fiddler's Reach right there. And the Kennebec proprietors this map was done in 1720. When they decided to subdivide this and sell it, they just essentially did strips across Arrowsic. And so what James Drummond did was he bought strips 24, 25, and 26, and then he split it in half and gave half to each of his 2 sons. And this was the side he gave, this was the part that he gave to Alexander Drummond. This is the 1764 deed from James Drummond to Alexander Drummond. There is an earlier record, but for whatever reason, the deed is not available in Wiscasset at the Lincoln County Registry. Of course, this gets now to talking a little bit about the Kennebec proprietors. We could do a whole hour, and Jack, you were worried about whether or not there's something for Arrowsic next year. Maybe we could, on the history of the Kennebec proprietors. Those of you who know anything about them is if you look in the dictionary, particularly a dictionary in 1720, and look up the word sleazebag, it would say. I recommend this book, which I just found. This is the library's copy, so I'll return it at some point. And Jack has also, there's another copy in the history room, which is basically the history. This book came out just a few years ago of the development of the Maine coast. And the involvement of the Jebscott proprietors who largely developed Brunswick and Topsom, and the Kennebec proprietors who at one point claimed to have 1 million acres on either side of the Kennebec. I don't even know if there are 3 million acres on the Kennebec River, but in any case, they were an unscrupulous group of absentee owners who were in Boston. And among the things that they did was some dubious legal strategies by which they were claiming all of this land. Now, you got to remember, by the 1700s, by the 18th century, a lot of this area has already been occupied by Larkin Lake, for those of you who know about that, and other groups. So they were fairly cutthroat, ruthless in trying to take claims that other people thought they had to their land to create this. And at the time, Maine only had one county, York County. And so Arrowsic, like everywhere else, was in York County. Well, the courts in York County were not very sympathetic to their cause. And so what the Kennebec proprietors did, of course, these are guys all in Boston who probably didn't even know where Maine was, but had a map, went to the state legislature and convinced them that they needed to create a new county in Maine, which was Lincoln County. And that not only that, but they would graciously build and staff a new court system in Lincoln County, which was much more sympathetic to their points of view. And then they were able to enact a lot of very dubious legal tactics, which I won't spend a lot of time on today. You can either read the book or get me off this meeting or whatnot. But they did, the Kennebec proprietors did sell James Drummond this land. That is a relatively new find on my part. The deed is not readily available. And the rest of the story, as I say, is that that's how the land originally got set up. Drummond family, I had one of my neighbors ask me this question the other day was, so what did Drummond do? Well, he was a sea captain. The total land mass that he was given, his half of those 3 strips, was over 100 acres at the time. Of course, we're down to about 8 acres now, but in any case, it's been subdivided lots of times. And this gives you an idea. This is the 1771 tax valuation. That book that I reference is available across the way. But it's also, again, for those of you who want to see source documents, this data and the source documents are in the state archives in Boston. So you can actually look at this. But this would have been the 1771 tax valuation for Alexander Drummond. And you will see that he did have his own ship or boat or whatever the right words are that he ran. And we'll talk about that a little more later. And you'll also see that he was only using about 25, 26 acres of this farm. In fact, he was leasing most of the farm out to other people, and there were a number of houses. Now, if you go back to those maps that I showed you earlier, you can see some other dots where there would have been other houses. One of the things that's interesting is by the way, if you do look at the maps, is that there are no houses in the interior of Arrowsic. And the reason there are no houses in the interior is because all these maps were drawn from the water, so they couldn't see them. But there are lots of houses in Dublin Point. And at one time, I've read at least one place, there were 11 houses. Today, there are about 15, so it hasn't changed that much in all these years, but ours is the only one that's old. Some of the other owners in the room may offer a different opinion as to how old their house is. But it gives you a sense of what the family was up to. He had Alexander Drummond had a number of children. And as I highlighted here, he eventually, his 3 children took over, including, but he also had daughters, but of course, in those days, daughters had no rights, much less property. So they are not included in most of that conversation. This is a reference from the Reed History of Bath. And we just had a conversation in the hallway about this, but it does talk about Alexander Drummond building a 90-ton sloop in what was essentially our front yard. So we do know whether it's this or the other one, we know he had boats, probably built his own, because as many of you know, through most of region's history, boats were owned and run by the people who constructed them. Somebody else may have financed it. And the like, and this actually, the date here, if it's correct, is 1780. The taxable list, which listed a ship, is 1771. Interestingly enough, when I went to the, I have not been back, but when I went 15 years ago to the to Boston to look at all of these things, none of the tax records ever listed a house. So I don't know how he convinced the tax collector that he had a boat, but didn't have a house. Maybe he's like that person who's living underneath the bridge. Those of you who drive over to Arrowsic, I don't know. The Drummonds left Arrowsic. And those of you, again, another story for another day, know that there was some issues in Arrowsic and in the meeting hall at what was the town of Georgetown on Arrowsic, about conflict is probably too strong a word, but disagreement, shall we say, on whether or not the town was duly Congregationalist or was Presbyterian, or probably more accurately, Church of Scotland. And the Drummonds, along with most of the other Presbyterians, moved over to Phippsburg. And those of you who go to the beautiful church in Phippsburg for the concerts and whatnot, that church was originally constructed with money from Arrowsic for all the people who were leaving Arrowsic and wanted to get out of here, get out of Arrowsic because of the Congregationalist people. Interestingly enough, and I was careful with my words, the literature says, at least most of what I've read, is it was a remarkably low level of friction between the two, but there definitely was two different constituencies. So Drummond decided this was not, now some Drummonds did stay in Arrowsic, by the way, but these Drummonds left. Alexander Drummond, Captain Alexander Drummond's headstone is over in Phippsburg. We do not know where his remains are. Somewhere probably on Arrowsic, but no one knows for certain. During the period in his later life, he passed the property off to his sons. There is some evidence, I guess it's the best way of putting it, that they were already trying to, the church, for example, in Phippsburg was built in 1803, I think. And so we believe the house went into some form of disrepair. They sold the house to Samuel Freeman. Samuel Freeman was also a sea captain. And the Maine Maritime Library actually has a record of some of the ships that he commanded. He then had a son, Samuel Freeman Jr., and another son after that. Mike Krendler sent me an article from one of the old newspapers. This is, by the way, if any of you, the library here has wonderful digital access to old newspapers, which you can get yourself caught up in. It's even worse than being addicted to Facebook. Well, the son that you sent me is Wilbur Freeman's brother. And so that he died. Wilbur Freeman decided he didn't want to be a farmer either, and we'll talk a little bit more about what he did. But those are the three deeds that existed for that period. That is Samuel S. Freeman, the not the older, but the second Freeman. This is there's grave sites. There is a small cemetery on the original property. It's not on our property anymore, where the Freeman where they are all buried, including Wilbur Freeman, as well as Samuel Sr. We don't know a whole lot about the Freeman, what they did when they were there, other than that Samuel Sr. did in fact command some vessels. But a lot of history was taking place in the house at the time. The one noteworthy is the conveyance of what is today the Doubling Point Lighthouse. Now, we can get into a whole conversation. And those of you who are interested in learning more about Fiddler's Reach and the lighthouses and the whatnot, I would refer you to Michael Krendler's presentation they did here in which is available on DVD. And he did an excellent job of doing more of the history of Fiddler's Reach in greater detail. But Samuel S. Freeman or Samuel Jr. Conveyed this in 1896, and I like to think that he did that in our living room. And then in 1898, his son conveyed the property for the range lights. And then Wilbur got fed up with it all and sold the place to John Currier. And John Currier and Celia Hutchins, who was his daughter, owned the house. It was the next family to own the house. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the fog tower was conveyed by John Currier when he was living in our house. One of the things that, talking about renovating and maintaining the house, as best we can tell, went through a number of periods where it was not properly maintained. I mentioned one earlier when the Drummonds left. Not sure what was going on in the end with the Freeman. Wilbur sold the house, moved to Bath, died and never married. He is buried out at Dublin Point, but doesn't even appear in any of the newspapers. So he led a pretty quiet life, I guess. We believe that at the end of the Freeman ownership of the house, it went through another period when John Currier bought the house. He was quoted in the newspaper as saying, or bought the farm, I should say. He was quoted as one of the things he wanted to do was to fix up the structure. So we know that he also took on the house it was in. Currier continued to farm until 1945. He died in 1946. You can see this map is an Air Force map, picture rather, from 1944, and if I blow up just that section, unfortunately, I have tried. I've spent hours trying to find the original photograph, going through again online. I haven't gone to I could go to Maryland and search through photos, but going through Air Force archives and things like that. This is a picture from, you see it's really screened, but you can see that's the house there. There's the road. And there's the lighthouse, there's the range lights. And this is in 1945, and you get an idea of how much of the area had no vegetation on it, was as in farm. According to Margaret Bertacci, he grew potatoes until the end of World War II. That is the history there. Celia Hutchins took over the property, and there's a lot of activity between 1946 and 1955 in terms of ownership and people doing things, but it's still, and I'm much better versed on it today than I was 7 years ago when I gave this talk last, but it's a little bit puzzled me why some people did things and why not, and I'm still trying to figure out who was related. And how that works. Laurel, are you here in the room? There you are. Hi, Laurel. Laurel has been helping me with this. Laurel is a relative, kind of distant, of Wiley Mitchell, who was Ethel Mitchell's son by her first marriage. And I did know about Wiley. Michael Krenber Wiley used to stay with Michael after, so he knew Wiley, and he was quite a nefarious guy. We could almost do another whole hour on him too. But in any case, what I'm still very unclear on is whether there were relationships, because Ethel Mitchell starts to appear in the newspaper articles, and this is Laurel what I wrote through the email, before she bought the house. And yet there was another family, the Mannings, who I don't even have up here, who had a bonded deed because they were going to buy the house from the Hutchins. And they never finished that deed. In fact, the house got sold to Ethel Mitchell. And then to confuse things even further, the Hutchins came back after Ethel Mitchell bought the property and then bought some of it back and lived for another 10 years, or at least had a house there, and then resold it back to Ethel. So I want to believe this is all the same family. And in my presentation that I gave 7 years ago, I had the Currier family and the Mitchell family as one, but I don't know for sure whether there's a relationship in there or not. But there was a lot of going back and forth that didn't fit with the ownership patterns. Mitchell family did enjoy it, and Laurel has sent me some wonderful stories. And for those of you who'd like, if you have any interest, when I gave this presentation 7 years ago, somebody came up to me at the end of the presentation, maybe this gentleman is in the room and he'll hopefully identify himself, and he handed me a CD which had a bunch of Super 8 movies shot in the 1950s of the house. Now he had them transcribed into an electronic format, and they unfortunately don't project well. If you don't see them in their smallest format, the minute you make them bigger, there's already missing detail. It's hard to read. However, they are on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, just go to youtube.com and type in Arrowsic. You will see the movies are there. If you would like to see some movies done a long time ago, there is film of the bell tower, fishing off of the bell tower. There's film of Five Islands and Reed State Park. And all told, it's about 6 minutes and kind of fun to watch. I would love to have shown it because it was one of the things they did in the movie in that DVD was they had a lobster cookout outside of our house, and you could see it. But unfortunately, projecting it just was not going to work, so I can't show it to you. Anyway, Wiley Mitchell, Ethel Mitchell's son, eventually takes ownership of the house and starts to divide it. There's the house there. Our property includes this spit going down to the water. This is now a separate house. This is now a separate house. There are the range lights, and this picture is from the early 1960s. And this is courtesy also of Mike Krenber. And they at the time used some of the old structures from the range lights. Again, if you go into the library website and look at some of the old newspapers and type in Ethel Mitchell Smith or Wiley Mitchell, you get all sorts of hits. In those days, the paper would feature it when somebody was coming up from Boston for a couple of weeks in Maine, which I was not aware of. So you can see all the time it came up and who they invited and all sorts of stuff. Ted and Margaret Bertacci bought the house in 1971. Ted did extensive renovation. Ted was an employee at Bath Iron Works, and one of the children lives in Dobson and comes by every so often. Ted died in the mid-90s. Margaret stayed on until about 2006, 2007, and we bought the house in 2008. Can you move the? I want to explain. So asterisks next. One of the themes that I've been trying to promote about this is the history of the house, and I find this fascinating. In fact, this is a change. I didn't know John Courier fit into this, but the people with the stars were all selectmen at one time or another, either in Georgetown or Arrowsic. John Courier was a selectman for 20 years. And that has got to be close to some kind of record. Yeah, for this job. So you have a long history of people who were not only active in lots of historical pursuits, but also active in their civic duties. This is one of the last slides. When we started our renovations on the house, this is the floor of the kitchen. The kitchen had a linoleum floor, and that's not going to do for Janet. And so that got taken up, and they found a subfloor. And then they started to take up the subfloor, and they found another layer of linoleum. And then underneath that, pine flooring. Now, the interesting thing about this pine flooring is you'll notice it's relatively narrow. Most of our original pine flooring, which we have a fair amount, is variable width, because in those days, of course, the trees came in variable sizes as opposed to. So this floor is relatively recent, probably sometime during the 20th century. The gray paint is post-World War II, when the Bath Iron Works was selling excess paint for 25 cents a gallon. And it appears in various places in the house. This particular area, it does not appear anymore, but if you were to come, we can show you some, or we purposely have left the gray paint there because it's part of the history. And again, goes to support my contention that as new owners came in, each of them did put in their own little tactics or touches to personalize the house for them. Today in the kitchen, there were a few places this had to be repaired, but most of the kitchen is this pine flooring here. So that sort of takes us through up to the modern day. I had a couple of conclusions. Number one is one of the things that has really become very profound for me personally is that the law says we own the house. Certain tax collector in Arrowsic says we own the house. But the fact of the matter is we really are guardians. We are really people who are only protecting the house for the next generation, whatever it might be that follows us. And you really feel that responsibility. I'm very proud of the fact that we tried hard and have continued to try hard to balance, as one history book I had, balance restoration with embalming in the work that we did to the house. I know for sure that we, in many instances, did not restore things to their original design, but used a more modern approach. But it is still a timber frame construction. You will find today, if you were to strip everything away, that in places we have replaced the timber frame that looks like that piece of wood there with modern pressure treated lumber and things like that. But we tried as hard as we can to maintain the character of the house itself. And it has a history that continues. This is what the house looks like today. 2 years ago, we put an addition on the house, largely because Janet and I knew that as we got older, crawling up those stairs was going to become more and more of a challenge. So we wanted to build something that we thought would be more conducive to our older age. There was a separate standalone garage, but it was only a matter of time before it was going to collapse. So we built a new garage. But this gives you, when we were constructing this, we ended up, because of the history and solar construction and whatnot, I ended up being the general contractor. And one of the strongest rules that I said to all the subs was, I don't care if 100 years from now, everything that we're building now falls down, you may not do anything that keeps this from standing. And in fact, the connection between is right behind the screened-in porch here. They were so careful, because I was watching, that the wall of the original house is now enclosed on 3 sides by a new wall, rather than taking the wall out to maintain it. So that if somebody in the future says, oh, boy, did the person's blow it with this ugly thing, they can tear it down, put a new door in, and nobody will know the difference. Thank you very much. I think we got about, if we stick to the hour format, we got about 10 minutes here. I'm happy to take questions or.
You mentioned the Presbyterian church and the division there, and I have some interest in that. Are you aware on the Vicksburg side, there was a Presbyterian church that shows up in the 1743 survey of Colonel Arthur Noble's here at the fort on the Vicksburg side.
I was not aware of that.
I'm your neighbor further on the Winnegans Creek and Crow Point, which
Sure.
you saw on your.
Yeah, I haven't done much history. We have some close and dear friends we've met long before either of us own this property in Maine, we live in Pittsburgh. And so we get over there pretty frequently, but I've never done any astronomical work other than the extent that visiting from.
There is a history there somewhere with these churches, and it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
Than you were just hinting at it.
I oversimplified it for sure. Other question? Yes.
I grew up in a 17th century house myself. And I'm always curious when we do renovations to how, like you say, that balance between modern and respecting the history of the house in terms of modernization, like insulation, heating, plumbing, electrical. What kinds of things have you done and how have you tried to maintain the history of the house in the process of modernizing it?
Most, first thing is on the older portion of the house, we've been very respectful of the structure. And as I suggested earlier, we've had to do a lot more work than I talked about, the sills rotting out, other posts and beams, and that's why we have this piece, and that's just one small fraction of what we've taken out. And we've tried as hard as we can to continue to maintain that. Also, we just replaced all of the windows in the house because the windows when we bought the house were vinyl windows that were put in the 1990s that were all beginning to crack and look bad. And in doing so, at considerable cost, we found the largest, there are very few people who do this, but the largest company in New England that builds all wood windows. So all of our windows now are all wood in things like that. So those are a couple of examples. In some of the areas, technology would be one, not be one. We have Ethernet throughout the house and things like that. But there again, I mentioned when I showed you the layout there and I said there was a TV room. That is the only room in the old house where you can hook up a TV. So you can't sit in the living room. I mean, unless you can bring a TV in, but you won't get any signal because there's nothing to hook it up to. So those are just a couple of examples. You've certainly read books, the molding on both we did a lot of work in the house to try to carry over some of the architectural elements. We were trying to make it age friendly, as I said, so we wanted to have rails throughout. Neither of us need that quite yet, but we may someday. And one of the things we did was to use a variant on the old chair rails that are in the older house to carry that over. The paints used are all the Benjamin Moore historic paint colors through the house, both the addition and the original part. So it's a bunch of little things. Those are just a couple that come to mind. That's enough. Yes.
We live in an old house also, only about 175 years old.
Oh, that's brand new. We don't.
Quite young, I understand. One of the issues is that it's uninsulated basically in the walls because it's 4x4 with wide boards. What did you do about that?
So actually, one of the things you'll notice is that the shingles, well, actually you can see, if you notice the shingles up here, those are all dark, but most of the new, we reshingled it in the most recent. That's the second time we've reshingled it. As we've reshingled the old house, we have added insulation outside of the existing structure. So we didn't make any effort. You still have the original boards underneath. We didn't do anything to touch either the timber frame
Right.
or the or the things like the purlins and whatnot. Purlin is a strip, you know, used.
What did you add for insulation? I mean, you couldn't add 6 inches of insulation.
Oh, no, and I assure you, particularly with the weather going on, if you sit in our bedroom, which is where that double door is, it's a lot warmer than if you sit in our parlor.
Got it.
So quite frankly, you can only go so far, but we did solid foam.
Okay.
That was,
We could only do type R.
well, we of course did type R
Yeah.
as well, yeah. I
That was
said
about
that.
all we could do. Okay, thank you.
That was really great. I'm curious as to the discussion about the Drummond division of the large piece to the two sons.
Mhm.
Do you know, have any idea where that line is? Is that still a property line or where that lands relative to feature?
You know, it goes beyond your property.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, but is it across 127, the main road, or is it on?
The best answer I can give you is what I've seen in the deeds, and the deeds make reference to what is later called State Road. It's never called Route 127. And I'm assuming it got State Road when Reed State Park opened and the state wanted some, but I'm presuming that road existed because there's reference to that road as being the eastern boundary.
So Ethel Mitchell Smith have then acquired that entire piece?
Yes.
So her deed would reflect that line?
Yes.
Got it,
correct.
thank you.
Yes, correct, absolutely. Correct. Other questions? Well, oh, sorry.
Your windows, the wooden windows, are they double pane or are they single pane?
They are single pane, but they are compliant. You can go to Green Mountain Windows in Rutland, Vermont, and go online and they will show you how they do that. Everything they do is custom anyway. So, but yes. And they are, by the way, I was talking earlier with this gentleman about insulation. The new windows are much more airtight than the windows that are replaced. That has it. But I will say that, yes, if you stand in our living room and, you know, put your finger in your mouth and then hold it up, you will feel a breeze. So they just don't build them the way they used to, I guess, or something. Yeah, the opposite of that. Any other questions? Well, thank you, everybody, and enjoy your.
Oh, yeah.